Geehrte Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie sehr herzlich zur 12. Simon Wiesenthal Lecture begrüßen. Nur diese Worte werden auf Deutsch gesprochen, der Rest kommt dann von mir in einem hoffentlich nicht ganz verfehlten Englisch, aber Professor Browning wird natürlich perfektes Englisch sprechen. Dear ladies and gentlemen, das haben wir noch richtig hingekriegt. As the chairman of the executive board of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, I would like to welcome you to the 12th Simon Wiesenthal lecture. Our speaker tonight is Professor Christopher Browning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, to whom I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome. I'm honored to be able to welcome tonight members of our International Academic Advisory Board. Tomorrow, the board will have its annual meeting discussing the upcoming academic focuses and projects. These annual board meetings, and especially the recommendations we have received from the board, are very helpful for us. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the board members for their efforts. I hardly have to stress how important it is for us to have this input from the outside. I have furthermore the pleasure to welcome the first fellows of the Institute who have just started to do their work in Vienna. They were chosen by the Academic Advisory Board from a large pool of applicants. We have 2 senior fellows, 2 research fellows, and 4 junior fellows. Their fields of interests are representative for the wide range of topics the Wiesenthal Institute is active in. Let me name some of those. Historical empirical research on the Holocaust. Issues of the politics of repressions in the Nazi-occupied countries. Research on the Roma Holocaust. Questions of memorialization of the Holocaust. Investigating different survival strategies of the victims. Looking into questions of forced migration and tracing the narratives of the Holocaust experience in different medias and the arts. I'm convinced that the choices of our advisory board will make this program a thorough success. And finally, it is my very special honor to introduce to you and to welcome to the Institute our new research program director, Dr. Eva Kovacs. Dr. Eva Kovacs is a sociologist and has taught at different Hungarian universities and colleges. She has been guest professor in Berlin, Bratislava, Trento, and Vienna. Since 2009, she has been head of the studies department of the Institute of Sociology at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. She has also participated in various oral history projects on the Holocaust, including the Mauthausen Survivors Documentation Project. She has furthermore instituted a digital archive of Holocaust survivors in Hungary. Her main fields of research are theories of memory in sociology, representations of Roma in modernity, and questions of Jewish identity in 20th century Hungary. At the VWI, Dr. Kovacs will not only be in charge of coordinating the fellows' projects, but also of planning, organizing, and directing the internal research discussions and seminars. At the same time, She will work together with the management, with Dr. Bela Raschke, in order to further develop the VWI research plan and projects. This will also cover concepts and ideas for events, conferences, and possible future exhibitions and public interventions of the Institute. So let me extend a warm welcome to Dr. Kovacs on behalf of the whole VWI team. We are thrilled to have you on board, and we are sure that this will be a very fruitful and successful cooperation. I'm at the end of my introductory remarks, and I hand over the microphone to Dr. Kovacs, who will introduce Professor Browning and chair today's lecture.
Georg, thank you very much for your kind words. I'm not sure that I deserve them, but I will do my best. The real subject of this evening is perhaps not me, but our distinguished guest, Professor Browning. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm also happy to welcome you to our 20th Simon Wiesenthal lecture. And let me briefly introduce our speaker. So Christopher Browning received the doctorate from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1975 and taught at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma between 1974 and 1999. He moved to North Carolina in 1999 and became the Frank Porter Graham Professor of History. As you may know, his main research field are the Holocaust perpetrators, the emergence of the Endlösung, and the Holocaust memories and testimonies. The main publications of Professor Browning include The Final Solution and the German Foreign Office, published in 1978, Faithful Months, Essays on the Emergence of the Final Solution, published in 1985, The Ordinary Man, 1992, Collected Memory, Holocaust History and the Post-War Memory, 2001, and his last book so far is Remembering Survivor, Inside the Nazi Slave Labor Camp, published 2 years ago. So we are very happy that you accepted our invitation, and the floor is open for you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and to lecture in Vienna. I appreciate the invitation of the Wiener Wiesenthal Institute very much. In February 1972, a 77-year-old retired policeman, Walter Becker, stood in a courtroom in Hamburg awaiting his fate, waiting for a judgment by Judge Erhard. Walter Becker had been a soldier in World War I, had become a career policeman in the Weimar Republic, specializing in the criminal police. He had joined the SPD in 1930, and therefore had been suspended from the police in the Machtergreifung in the spring of 1933. Very quickly, he made his peace with the Nazis, was reinstated in the Kriminalpolizei, took Nazi Party membership, though his application to join the SS was never accepted. In 1940, he was sent to a small industrial town in south-central Poland, the town of Starachowice, where he served as the chief criminal police officer under in a Gestapo agency. And when the Gestapo officers were sent elsewhere in 1941 to staff, of course, the vastly expanding Nazi empire, Walter Becker found himself as the senior officer and therefore basically the chief of police in the town of Starachowice for the rest of the war. He was never accepted into the SS, never promoted, never transferred, By Nazi standards, this was an astoundingly mediocre career. For the Jews of the adjoining town of Wierzbnik, a small Jewish town next to the Polish industrial town of Starachowice, Walter Becker, on the other hand, was the lord of life and death. He was the man who ruled over the ghetto, where he went constantly to have gifts given to him on a quite regular basis. And he was the man in charge on October 28, 1942, when nearly 4,000 Jews were sent to Treblinka without a single survivor, and some 1,600 Jews from the Wierzbnik ghetto were sent into a complex of labor camps in Starachowice, where I estimate that roughly 600 to 700 ultimately survived the war. It was for this action, being the man in charge of the liquidation of the Wierzbnik ghetto, with its many thousands of fatalities, that Walter Becker had finally been put on trial in Hamburg in 1971 into 1972. When Judge Erhardt began reading his verdict, he made clear that the main source of evidence against Walter Becker had been eyewitnesses who, because they had been sent to the labor camp, had survived. This was a rare case where the prosecution in Germany had no shortage of witnesses. Many dozens of survivors came to the courtroom, and one after another gave a litany of testimony against Walter Becker, of things he had done on the central center of town on the day of the liquidation of the ghetto, as well as many other things over the 4 or 5 years that he reigned over the city of Starachowice. Therefore, Judge Erhardt had to address the issue of eyewitness testimony. And he began his verdict stating that of all the forms of evidence with which the judiciary must deal, eyewitness testimony was the least reliable. That eyewitnesses, to be credible, had to be, and here I quote his own words, had to be disinterested, indifferent, attentive, intelligent, and that this, of course, was not the case here. These were cases now that were 29 years in the past, and these were people who were terribly distraught on the day in which they were giving testimony about, because for the vast majority of them, most of their families had disappeared and they had never seen them again. Judge Erhardt therefore concluded that the Jewish witnesses in this courtroom had to be, quote, bad witnesses. Having made a global statement to delegitimize all of the testimony in the courtroom, he then went on and one by one and in various extraordinary ways disparaged the individual witnesses one by one, often demanding, setting a standard of perfection and consistency nowhere to be found in the real world, against which he measured these witnesses and found them wanting. Not surprisingly, therefore, Judge Erhardt announced a verdict of not guilty, and Walter Becker left the courtroom unconvicted and with his police pension intact. By the time I read this verdict in 1987 in Ludwigsburg, I, of course, had been working in German judicial records for some 15 years. I had read many verdicts, many of them good and many of them not good. But I had never read anything quite so incredibly bad as this. Such an egregious miscarriage of justice I had not encountered before. And therefore, I kind of marked it and said, this is something I clearly must come back to. If Judge Erhardt could not put Walter Becker in jail, I could at least put him in historian's hell. I could put him between two covers of a book on a shelf where for eternity his misdeeds could be documented. Well, I in fact had many other obligations which I had to fulfill, and it was over 10 years before I got back to this case. And when I began researching it in the late 1990s, fortunately, I had become less angry, but more fascinated with two questions that the case raised. One of these was the, in a sense, big lacuna in Holocaust historiography, and that is the phenomenon of the factory slave labor camp. The camps to which the surviving Jews of Wierbschnick had been sent on the day of selection and the liquidation of the ghetto were not SS camps. These were camps built, guarded, managed by the Braunschweig Stahlwerke, a subsidiary of the Hermann Göring Werke. This was free enterprise Germany at work in Poland, and these were private camps. This was a part of the world of Nazi camps that had received all too little attention, and I now had a case study, in a sense, which could open up and allow me to look into this wider, understudied phenomenon of the factory slave labor camp. The second issue that increasingly attracted my attention was the nature of using survivor testimony as evidence for writing Holocaust history. It became increasingly clear that there were virtually no written documents to work with. There were a handful of documents in the Starachowice archives from the Kreiskommandant, but there was virtually nothing else to work with if I was going to write a history of the ghetto and the camps in Starachowice. It would overwhelmingly have to be based upon survivor testimony. There were a handful of fairly mendacious testimonies by the perpetrators in court, but they would not be of much use. So these became, in a sense, the dual focus of my study, that what could we learn about the wider phenomenon of the factory slave labor camp, and how could we use survivor testimony as about the only source of evidence we had to write a reliable history that would be respected by my colleagues and accepted by the standards of the historical profession. So I began to collect more testimony. The court case and the files at Ludwigsburg had 125 testimonies from survivors that had been gathered in the 1960s. I found a small group of early testimonies taken between 1945 and 1948. Many of them were very brief and very nominal, not very important, but 3 of them were in extraordinary detail and great length and were part are referred to constantly in the footnotes of the book that resulted. There was then a very long pause between 1948 and the 1960s, aside from a handful of testimonies at Yad Vashem, nothing. Then the judicial investigation, testimonies collected in the late 60s and presented in court in 1971. And then again, a pause. And it is, of course, in the 1980s and 90s that the systematic projects to collect testimony began. So I had a small group of testimonies at the Fortunoff Archive in Yale, a small group of testimonies at the United States Holocaust Museum, a few other testimonies scattered here and there. And these were all in the form of what I would call free-form testimonies. That is, someone introduces a survivor, the camera rolls, these are now videotaped as opposed to earlier being transcribed, and the survivor simply tells his or her story as he or she chooses, and that there is no interference, interruption, there is no interview from the outside. And then beginning in the mid-1990s, of course, was the vast project of the Visual History Foundation archive, the Spielberg project, in which over 120 testimonies of Starachowice survivors were taken. And in contrast to the earlier free-form testimonies, here were testimonies taken by an interventionist interviewer. That as part of the Spielberg project was that interviewers would be given a short orientation course, and then they would be assigned a series of people to interview, and they would have a standard set of questions they were to ask of every survivor from a particular country. They wanted to have a standard database. So if people were in the ghettos and camps in Poland, they would be asked about religious practice in the camps. They'd be asked various common questions. The interviewer was also to structure the interview so that about a quarter of the interview would be based on the pre-war period, about a half the interview would be based on the wartime period, and a quarter of the interview would be based on the post-war. These were to be life stories, not just accounts of experiences of the Holocaust. And so these interviews ran very differently. The interviewer is an active participant, and if the witness or the testifier began to diverge from a clean chronological record, the interviewer would pull them back. If they began to digress, the interviewer would pull them back and would ask a series of standard questions. And finally, after 2000, I interviewed 15 of the survivors. These were almost all teenagers in the camps, not the adults in the camp, but teenagers who now were in their late 70s, but still quite lucid, quite anxious to talk, and able to remember in considerable detail. Well, I came away with this ultimately with 292 people who had given one or more testimonies. Some gave multiple testimonies. And convinced that there is no single best way to do oral history. There were advantages to the different ways in which testimony was taken. For instance, if I wanted to learn about the German perpetrators, almost all of that material is in the German judicial investigations. Left to themselves, the survivors say almost nothing about the Germans. Sometimes you will get the names of one commandant, and that will be all. They are talking about their families, their experiences, what happened to their families and loved ones. If I'm looking at your German judicial testimonies, of course, they're collecting evidence for court. I learned almost nothing about the internal dynamics of the Jewish community, because that's outside the interests of the judicial investigators. The free-form testimonies are important because they show how a survivor constructed their own stories, but often they jump from one place to another. There is no chronological coherence. Sometimes they forget to even mention whole blocks of time. The interventionist testimonies, on the other hand, may be very coherent, but there were cases when a survivor was edging towards a very sensitive issue, couldn't come and address it frontally, and just as they were about to get to what I wanted to hear, the interviewer would pull them back and say, "Don't digress." And I would want to reach through the screen and strangle them and say, "How dare you interrupt just when I'm getting to what I wanted to hear." So there were advantages and disadvantages to each form of testimony. In the end, it is good that I had some of every kind so that I could get the benefits of all and hopefully neutralize the disadvantages of all in terms of what I finally ended up with. Needless to say, using these testimonies to write history is highly problematic. Certainly one tendency has been to kind of put survivor testimony on a pedestal. Who are we who were not there to question what we are told? And that, of course, for an historian is a path to disaster. One has to only think of the Wielkomirski memoirs to know that you cannot simply take a testimony and put it on a pedestal and not subject it to a critical historical study, that you have to have a certain stance of skepticism when you approach it, however inappropriate that may seem to others. For many people, the notion that a younger historian who was not there in the safety of being born after World War II should dare to subject these testimonies to cold analysis is for some people blasphemy. But for an historian, I think it is absolutely essential. For some, the value of the testimony is not in its accuracy, not in reconstructing a story that otherwise we don't have, but is authenticity. What they want to find is what was the feeling of the person in this experience, how do they remember it. They want a subjective side, and they will say the testimonies are important for the subjective side, but don't bother about accuracy. Accuracy is not what these testimonies are about. For me, accuracy was part of what these testimonies were about. I could not write a history of the Jews in these camps unless I asked factual questions. What was the sequence of commandants? What was the way in which the camp was run? Various events. I was looking for accuracy. I was looking for, quote, the facts, and trying to extract them from a multitude of different memories, people with different vantage points, different perspectives, different ways in which they had experienced these, and people with absolutely conflicting memories about things that, if both sides could not be true, that you simply had to make choices in terms of how you were going to evaluate it. Certainly there were several things that I had expected when I began the project that I was surprised to find did not turn out to be true. I had thought that over time, as the survivors settled in a kind of three clusters of communities, there is a large community of Starachowice survivors in Toronto, Canada. There is a cluster of survivors in Israel, and a more dispersed group of survivors in the eastern part of the United States. And I thought over time, as they met with each other and had their local reunions, that a homogenized common narrative of the Toronto Jews would take place, and there would be a somewhat different Israeli story as they kind of reached their homogenized account, and that there would be an American story. I'd have diverging communal stories of the Toronto version, the Haifa version, and the American version. In fact, that did not happen. That the core memory remained fairly consistent. I did not get identifiable different versions as these testimonies became both more homogenized but divergent based upon where the survivors had settled. I had also thought that over time the description of events and people, particularly sensitive topics, would become flatter, that the complexities of the Holocaust would give way to simpler stereotypes and to caricatures, and that they would be sanitized, and that the very, very complex issues that we know were part of the story would be flattened out over time. On the contrary, I found some of the most sensitive issues could not be broached until 1989 and after. That there are whole areas that are not in the early testimonies, not in the German judicial testimonies, that begin to appear in 1989 and in my oral interviews after 2000 could be talked about face-to-face in a much more open way. Two of these key, one is the issue of rape and sex in the camps, and the other was of revenge killings within the prisoner community, topics that did not get broached until very late in life by the survivors. So that contrary to what had been my intuition, it is in fact with greater distance that more sensitive topics could be broached by the survivors. Now, a historian working in this material must keep in mind, of course, that an event and the memory of an event are different things. And I was working with the different memories of the event, and in fact, what I would say, layers of memory. And as I worked in the materials, increasingly I realized that I was just excavating sort of the first and second layers, and in fact, there are all parts of memory that I was never going to access. Certainly the least accessible layer of memory is what I would call repressed memories. These are events that were so searing, so traumatic, that the survivor himself or herself still does not remember it. Maybe there will be recovered memories for a few, but some things we will never know. Some people will never know all of their own story. Now, I became aware of this not through the Holocaust survivors. I came to this awareness basically through the experience of my uncle in World War II. He had been in Singapore in January, February of 1942, had sent his wife and child on one of the last boats across the Indian Ocean, had decided he would stay. He was a missionary and he didn't want to leave his flock. So he stayed when the Japanese arrived, and of course, he was immediately interned as an enemy civilian and spent 3.5 years in the infamous Changi prison and barely survived. Before he left, he of course had made all sorts of calculations about whether he should leave or not. What was his higher obligation to his parishioners or to his family? 3.5 years later, he had absolutely no memory whatsoever of having had the option of leaving. He could not have survived 3.5 years in Changi prison if every day he had beaten himself up over having made the wrong, naive choice and had stayed when he could have gotten away. It was only by going back and digging up the diary in his garden that he had buried before he went into the prison that he was able to recover what was a totally repressed memory. And here repressed memory is a defense mechanism. It allowed people to cope with their daily travails without having to carry the burden of past experiences and past mistakes, which would have been totally psychologically crippling. But it does mean that historians listening to survivors have to be aware that there are things that happen to them that they themselves do not know and will never know. And that's simply part of what we must realize. There are, of course, secret memories, things that they do remember but are so painful and so delicate that they've never told another soul. Once in a while in memoirs, you get that confessional moment in which a survivor will say, I've never said this to anyone else, and now they will reveal something for the first time. They carry a burden of secret memories that sometimes they make public, but it makes us aware that there are many other things that survivors carry with them that only they know, but which they simply will not tell to anyone else, because again, they are so painful and so sensitive. There are what I call communal memories. These are memories from the people in the same camp or in the same ghetto that all of the people in that group know perfectly well and talk about all the time, but do not talk to people outside the group about these things. That it would be an asocial act to talk about something that they say people outside would not understand the context. They would read it wrong, they would make false and simplistic judgments. So these things we'll keep among ourselves. And then finally, there are public memories. And these, of course, are what I basically had to work with. That part of the memory that the survivors are willing to talk about, give their public testimonies about, put on tape, and make part of the public record, or to write in memoirs. Now, these are not static and fixed lines. There are secret memories that become public. There are communal memories that become public. And gradually, there are lots of things that, as I said, before 1989 were not talked about, but that after 1989 increasingly could become a subject of conversation and was no longer considered a violation of the trust of those in the community to talk to outsiders about it. And so a communal memory could become a public memory. The historian also, of course, has to be aware of certain pitfalls, and I would say the two major pitfalls or major things that I had to be constantly conscious of when using this collection of testimonies were what I call collective memory on the one hand and incorporated memory on the other. Now, of course, collective memory is something that's very broadly talked about in the profession, the way in which over time a community chooses to select and emphasize certain aspects of its experience, repress or be silent about others, and that the ultimate memory out there that is shared with others is more of a reflection of the needs of the post-war period than what happened in 1940 to 1945. Certainly, in terms of Starachowice, or the Wierbstnik, the Jewish community of Wierbstnik, and eventually the Starachowice camps, the most sort of obvious example of the interference of collective memory came not related to the Holocaust, but came in relation to how people remembered the pre-war community. Among survivors in North America, they will describe Wierbstnik as a fairly backward, traditional, very observant, very conservative Jewish community, that there is no mention of the Bund, there's no mention of Hatzmir HaShair, the very left-wing radical youth group, that this was a very observant community. 80% went to the Hayden religious school, about 20% to the Hebrew school, and that life was very much governed by the religious tradition. In the Israeli community, by the 1970s, when they produced their community book, Wierbstnik is a hotbed of Zionism. That everybody is in youth groups and they're playing Zionist sports and Zionist hiking clubs and Zionist discussion, and you wouldn't know there was a traditional observant Jew in all of Wierbstnik. This is clearly a case where survivors in Israel are remembering and in a sense, over-expanding those aspects of the Zionist tradition where diaspora Jews of a conservative sort were not highly valued, but young Zionist pioneers were. And on the contrary, in the United States, where people chose to come to the United States, the need to validate a Zionist background is not great. If you needed that, you would have gone to Israel rather than to Canada or to the United States. A second area where a historian has to be very careful is what I call incorporated memory. that the survivors after the war, reading books, seeing documentaries, begin to confuse their own memory with things they learned later, and they incorporate into their memory and can't distinguish any longer. Now, one of the advantages of the Starachowice camps is that nobody had ever heard of them. And the result was there were no books on Starachowice. There were no movies on Starachowice. So the Starachowice memories were fairly pristine. But one could see in these, once they arrive at Birkenau, the labor camps in Starachowice are evacuated at the end of July 1944, when the Red Army has reached the Vistula. They don't know they're going to stop. They think they're going to arrive any day. So they evacuate by train the prisoners of the Starachowice camps to Birkenau. Now, the majority of the testimony is very clear that the miracle of this transport is that it went into Birkenau without a selection. It was treated as an internal labor transfer from one labor camp to another. And this was so unusual, so striking, that they remembered this. And above all, the children remember this. They know they would not be alive if there had been a selection on the ramp. Nonetheless, the power of incorporated memory and the iconic trope of the arrival at the ramp is such that I have a not insignificant group of people from Starachowice on the same train, arrived the same day, had the same experience, and they will look at the camera and they will tell you they arrived at the ramp, they got out, and there is Dr. Mengele, left, right, and some are sent to the gas chambers and some are sent into the camp. I'm convinced that did not happen. I'm convinced they believe it happened, but I believe they've incorporated that from the overwhelming power of the post-war story of how one arrives at Auschwitz, above all in the Elie Wiesel night and in other iconic accounts, that they no longer can separate out what they experienced and what they think they must have experienced, because that's how the story is told in virtually every other account. So one has to work through these kinds of problems. It's a very problematic body of evidence. But in the end, historians have problems with all kinds of evidence. There's no such thing as unproblematic evidence. If we wrote history from only the evidence that was unproblematic, we'd have very little history. What's important here is then to be conscious of what those problems are in this particular kind of evidence, to adjust for it, to take it into account, but not to run away from it and not to refuse to use it just because you have frailty of memory, you have incorporated memory, you've got secret memories, you've got all of these issues where you're not going to get the full story. But nonetheless, with enough testimony from people in the same place at the same time, the historian, I would argue, can put together a very full account, and one that in the end is historically respectable, will stand up to what the demands and standards of our profession are. What do we learn about the survivor community and about the experience of the factory slave labor camps? Well, since I was interested in two broad issues. On the one hand, I was interested in what do we learn about the Germans and German policies through the memories of the survivors, which adds to our understanding from simply depending upon German documents. And secondly, what do we learn about the dynamics of the survivor community, of the Jews and the experience, and how they strove to cope and to deal with the situation they found themselves in. Let me turn to the first issue first, that is Nazi policies and Nazi personnel. Clearly, one of the issues that is debated by historians very often is the conflict and balance between the ideological imperative to murder Jews and the economic necessity to win the war. And that at certain points, these came into conflict, nowhere more clearly than the fate of skilled Jewish workers performing labor in crucial parts of the German war economy. Well, Starachowice was a town that the Poles after World War I turned into a town important for their own war industry. There was already a blast furnace and steel mill there. They built a munitions factory there. So this was designed as a town to be part of the economic infrastructure of the Polish military. It is, of course, immediately taken over by the Germans in 1939. Hermann Göring-Werke grabs it, and basically the Braunschweig-Stahlwerke is put in charge of making it work. So they run both the steel mill and the munitions factory. So here is clearly an economic enterprise that is going to be at the heart of the German military economy. Now, in spring and summer of 1942, when Himmler is now beginning to clear the ghettos, and the issue arises of how many Jews will be exempted for labor. In the end, he takes a very hard line and sets up 3 conditions for private industry in Poland using Jewish labor. And the first of these conditions was that it had to be truly a military industry. You couldn't be doing something subsidiary. Well, making grenades and bullets in a munitions factory clearly is military. Starachowice passed. The second was that the factory owners had to build their own camps to keep the Jewish workers totally separate from the rest of the community, so the ghettos could be totally liquidated. They didn't want these rump ghettos left, and it took a long time, in fact, to clear them. But to keep your Jewish workers, you were supposed to build your own camps on your own factory grounds and guard them with your own security forces. And the third condition that Himmler set was that the Jewish workers that were spared were the property of the SS to be rented to the factory owners on a per head per day basis. This is slave labor in the most literal sense. These people are property of the SS, and they are rented contractually to the factory owners at a stipulated rate, 5 zloty per head per male Jew, 4 zloty per head per female Jew per day. The factory owners have to feed them, but they don't pay them. The money they pay out goes directly to the higher SS and police leader in Radom, in this case. Those are the conditions that Himmler set down, and on those basis, some 1,600 Jews in Starachowice are spared, being sent to Treblinka, and they are dispersed in 3 camps, 1 camp next to the munitions factory, 1 camp that was next to the steel mill, and a 3rd smaller camp that was next to a lumber mill, where they made the crates in which the ammunition and grenades would be packed. So there are 3 camps in this complex, 2 of them constructed and built by the Braunschweig-Stahlwerke. 1 is built by the owner of the Aryanized Jewish lumber mill and is in a somewhat different system. How did these camps differ in terms particularly of mortality from the SS camps? Initially, I would say not at all. In fact, when these camps are built, they are built in a ramshackle way. This is in the fall of 1942. The factory owners are given very little lead notice. If they want to keep their workers, they must build these camps very rapidly. They don't know how to build camps. They don't know the problems one's going to encounter with sanitation and epidemic and so forth. So the camps are thrown together very quickly. The sanitation facilities, washing facilities are abysmal, totally inadequate. And the result is, very quickly in the camps, typhus epidemic spreads. Once you had typhus epidemic, of course, Jewish workers began to get sick, and which means that even if they were not killed by the epidemic, there would be 3 weeks of very high fever, 104, 106 Fahrenheit, I forget what that is in Celsius, and that even after the fever broke, if they survived, they would be totally debilitated for another 3 weeks. So that for a Jewish worker to get typhus meant that they would not work for at least 6 weeks. Nonetheless, the factory owner had to pay per head per day whether the Jewish worker was working or not. Initially, for the factory owners, the factory managers in Starachowice, this was an intolerable drain on profits. And the result is, unlike some factories, where they would periodically invite the Gestapo to come in and carry out a selection and kill workers that were too weak to work, in Starachowice, the factory security came and basically called the camps, carried out rolling executions and selections day after day, so that in the first 5 months of the camp, from the fall of 1942 to the spring of 1943, it is a veritable bloodbath. The fatality rates in these camps is extraordinarily high, and the killing is done by the security force of the factory managers, not by bringing in outside executioners. The security force is made up of a few officers who are German or Volksdeutsch. The rank and file are Ukrainians. Ukrainians who had fled with ethnic Germans in 1939, 1940, when the commissions came to take ethnic Germans out of the areas that Stalin had received as a result of the non-aggression pact. They get to the German zone. It's obviously they're not German. They won't get Volksdeutsch status. But the Germans keep them to use to guard railways and to guard factories. So they become a police force that is calculated to have the least contact with the Polish population, but to provide German manpower. And so it is this group that carries out the killings, and as I say, for the first 5 months, it is a very high fatality rate. By the spring of 1943, however, when Himmler is making his second sweep, and the rump ghettos are being liquidated, and very soon there will not be any Jews left in Poland who are not in hiding or under false papers or already in camps, it becomes increasingly clear that new workers are not going to arrive, and that the workers who are being killed are not going to be replaced. And suddenly the calculation, the bottom line profit calculation, alters. Dead Jews cannot be brought back to life. Sick Jews can be healed. You have a labor scarcity. Therefore, you stop killing sick workers. And the most extraordinary thing happens. The killer commandant is sent away in March of 1943 after this 5-month bloodbath. And one of the managers from the factory, the grenade division, comes in, and he gives a speech to the prisoners. And the prisoners, of course, remember this speech. It's very memorable. He comes in and says, "We're not going to kill you anymore if you get sick. You can report illness. All you have to do is continue to work loyally, and you will live." You don't forget that speech. And in fact, that is the new policy. Food improves, living conditions improve, the death rate goes way down. And for the rest of the war, the death rates in these factory labor camps is very low and fairly steady. From that point on, when prisoners are killed, it's in some incident other than just a general killing of weak workers, and each of these the prisoners can remember and describe in various ways somebody trying to escape or something of that sort. So initially, the factory management is just as murderous as the SS. After there's an acute labor shortage, then in fact they moderate their policy and they put a priority on preserving Jewish labor as opposed to the reckless killing that had preceded it. And a kind of stabilization sets in. What about the Germans in the camp? Now, this of course is a topic that had come up earlier in my book, Ordinary Men, in which there have been various issues taken with that book. So I was very interested in finding out, how do the Germans look through the eyes and the memories of the prisoners? For the prisoners, in fact, as I read one or saw one testimony after another, a pattern began to emerge. And it is clear for them, it's clear to me from their testimonies, that they had categorized the Germans into 3 broad categories. And it was necessary to distinguish between different kinds of Germans if you were going to survive. You had to know which kind of German that you were dealing with, and that was essential for survival. And the 3 categories were, first of all, the dangerous Germans, the gefährliche Deutschen. These were people like the killer commandant. When they came to camp, they always left dead Jews behind, that they were killing Jews constantly. When they came, you hid. You got out of the way. You were as invisible as you possibly could be. The second group of Germans were a small group that they called the decent Germans, the anständige Deutschen. These were people who would treat them as human beings, in fact, that they could turn to get help in times of emergency, and a few names would continually pop up. And certainly for the survivors, they wanted these people to be included in the story. I remember very much, once of course they began interviewing survivors, the phone network between them spreads, And I would be contacted by survivors to say, why don't you come interview me? I mean, they would solicit me. And I remember I got a call from New York, and it was in a very strong East European accent. I hear you're working on the Starachowice. And I said, yes. And that you're taking interviews. I said, yes. Well, you must interview me. And I said, yes. And I arranged to go. And what was clear was that the center of his story was a man named Bruno Papa, who managed one of the units within the factory. And that this young man, he had been a teenager then, but had been sort of the favorite of Bruno Papa and the intermediary between Bruno Papa and the rest of the prisoners. And in that particular section, Jews are not harassed, they're not screamed at, they're not denigrated. And if you had Jews who were weak or you had elderly Jews that you wanted to be able to survive, you tried to get them transferred into that unit because they would be treated, quote, much more decently. Certainly the most prominent among the, quote, decent Germans were the two Germans who ran the lumberyard. This, of course, was outside the Braunschweig Stahlwerke, outside the factory security. They had Aryanized this lumberyard before, already had some Jewish workers. On the day of the evacuation, they went to the marketplace and picked up as many others as they could, more than they needed, and brought them to live on the site of the lumber mill. The lumber mill had no guards and no fences. You didn't need them. If you were a Jew in Poland, this was the safest possible place you could be. You were doing everything you could do to get there, not to escape. And so you didn't need guards and you didn't need fences. This was a haven where he made very clear, when you see me leave, run for it. But as long as I'm here, I'll take care of you. And so the lumberyard became, in a sense, a strange little haven in the middle of central Poland, where Jews, as I say, sought to get transferred to, paid bribes to get transferred into, because it was the safest place in this whole region. So the third group was what they referred to as the corruptible Germans. Who could you make deals with? Who was susceptible to bribery? Now, of course, when one reads German documents, one gets the image of the Herrenmenschen coming to the east to set up civilization over these primitive eastern peoples, and they are bringing law and order and cleanliness to these dirty primitive lands. When one reads Jewish testimony, one reads about rampant corruption that knows no end, that every German there is filling his pockets and stealing anything he can to enrich himself as fast and quickly as he possibly can. You get these utterly different images in these two different sources. So one leverage that Jewish survivors or imprisoned Jews had, ghettoized Jews, was to find out who among the Germans was most susceptible to bribery and with whom you could negotiate and cut deals. And these people became very important too. And that a number of agreements were reached, in fact, between Germans that were in fact on retainer. They got constant fixed payments week after week in return for certain kinds of favors. They would give warning when an inspection was coming so that children could be hidden. There was another agreement that would keep the Ukrainian guard outside the fence, and only the Lagerpolizei of the Jews themselves would be governing within the camp. And they, of course, made lots of agreements about smuggling and these kinds of things. So the corruptible Germans were very essential, and you had to know who was the corruptible German. You approach a dangerous German trying to make a deal, and you're dead. You had to know these things if you were going to survive. Well, that sort of German policy and the way in which the German personnel is remembered, what can we say about the Jewish community itself? Well, first of all, it is a very diverse one. It is not a homogeneous community. You have all sorts of different groups of Jews that come in at certain stages. So we begin with the local Wierbschnik Jews, that is those that have been before 1939. As I say, it is basically a traditional Orthodox community, Yiddish speaking, and very observant. In 1940, 3 trainloads of Jews are brought from Western Poland that is being incorporated into the Third Reich, and Jews are being ethnically cleansed. So 2 trainloads of Jews come from Łódź, and 1 trainload of Jews comes from Płock. So you suddenly get a huge number of Western, more urbanized, more modernized, more assimilated Jews that are thrust into this tiny community of Wierbrznik in central Poland, who are of somewhat different background. Strangely enough, in fact, relations between the newcomers and the original natives seem to have been pretty good. That is, you don't get stories of terrible tensions, and they seem to have melded together fairly amicably. In the summer of 1942, once the ghetto clearing has begun, and of course it begins with the clearing of the Lublin ghetto in March of 42, and then begins to spread to other parts of Poland. And rumor of this, of course, spreads all over Poland. And lots of Jews in the surrounding area immediately begin to say, where is the town where I could get employment that would make me essential to the German war economy? And so local Jews begin to flood into Wierbrznik from surrounding areas, trying to get work in the factories. And inside the German factory, in fact, there are people making money selling work permits. The selling of work permits to Jews becomes a big business. And this is one of the most peculiar things about the slave labor of the Wierbrznik Jews and the others who end up in the Starachowice camps. These are slaves who have bought themselves into slavery. They've paid the Germans to be enslaved because the alternative is to be murdered in Treblinka. Now, we have many kinds of slavery, but this is the only kind I know of in my scant history of slavery, where people buy themselves into slavery, pay other people to enslave them. This was very unusual. But nonetheless, in the circumstances, was absolutely essential and is one of the prime survival tactics. Survival through labor, buy your work permit for your wife, for your children, and work in the factories. So when the ghetto is liquidated, you will be left behind. And it is very key. So you have a group of others coming to Wierbrznik, many of them actually brought to Wierbrznik by German trucks because they've paid for a truck ride and a work permit. They're dumped into the ghetto and then thereafter marched out to the factories every day. Once the liquidation of the ghetto has taken place and the camps are sort of more or less stabilized, in 1943, 1944, as other camps in Poland are closed down, there are small batches of Jews that do come into Starachowice from elsewhere as kind of a fourth layer. So you have the original natives, you have the Western Jews coming in from Lodz and Plock, you have the neighboring Jews coming in 42, and then a fourth layer are the small groups that are brought into the Starachowice camps in 1943 and even into the spring of 1944. The real tension seems to have emerged between these last people who come in and the others. The camp council is basically controlled by original people there, the camp police. The best jobs by then are, of course, controlled by those that are already there. When the last transports come in, they are immediately at the bottom of the pecking order, even if they are the hardy survivors of a remnant of a remnant of a remnant from previous elections. They are treated terribly and are put at the bottom. And so that's where the real tensions ultimately, I think, emerge. If there are these four layers of prisoners that go in, the divisions and tensions are multiplied or intensified in two other ways. One way in which tensions and divisions within the prisoner community are intensified is by German manipulation. And this is basically the capo system. Now, this was invented long before Jews were incarcerated. It is, of course, in Dachau in 1933 that they work out the system whereby you have privileged prisoners, in that case hardened criminals, brought in to terrorize the political prisoners and to receive favors, and the more they serve as tools of the SS and do the work of the SS guards, the more they keep their privileges, and so that you play one kind of prisoner against another. Jeremiah Wilczek, who had a dubious pre-war career, he does not come out of the older Jewish council elite, and he surrounds himself with a coterie of favorites and family members, and they, of course, dominate the council, they dominate the police, they dominate the barrack supervisors, they dominate the kitchen. That's where they send all of their wives to work, because, of course, being in the kitchen is key for who gets more food and who does not. They dominate the assignment of jobs. Who's working at the face of the blast furnace, who is sitting on a stool counting bullets in a tray or crate. And some jobs were terribly physically taxing, others were not. So that you had this built-in inequality by the fact that you had a group of privileged Jews. Very little carryover from the Jewish Council of Wiesenthal to the Lagerrat of the camp. 3 of the 24 members of the Jewish Council, in fact, remain on the Lagerrat, but it is mostly a new group and a kind of negative selection out of those who had been most cooperative with the SS in various ways, or not the SS, but with factory management. And they are a very dubious group. So you have a tension, hatred of the privileged Jews on the part of many. I better get myself. A second intensifying factor to the inequality within the prisoner community is economic. Since some of the prisoners in this camp are natives from the local area, and others come in from the outside, the people who were from the local area, who had business partners, friends, acquaintances, basically had people with whom they could leave property, had an immense advantage. Because the Jewish workers from the camps are marched to the factory, Polish workers come in from elsewhere at the factory, they meet together, and all sorts of trade can go on. And that Jews who had left property with friends and acquaintances could, in fact, recover some of this, get it smuggled into camp, where they could then use it to purchase extra food, to buy more comfortable, less physically taxing jobs, and basically to have a better life. Given the control of the camp by the privileged Jews, almost everything was for sale. You wanted a different job, how much did you pay for it? You want to smuggle in medicine from the outside because your mother is ill, you pay for it. So that having an economic resource in camp was absolutely crucial for having an advantage of survival. And local Jews being able to recover property had an immense advantage in this regard. So that was another tension and source of inequality in the camp. Most of the survivors who went through a series of camps over the whole period of the war would think back and they would say Starachowice had the most inegalitarian camp culture of any camp they had been in. The disparity between privileged and property Jews and others was the greatest, and that this is, sort of in a sense, what distinguished the camp culture from a whole series of different camps they would eventually go through. Now, despite these various divisions and despite the sources of tension in the camp, of the first come, who's last in being least privileged, the camp management, the different economic resources, nonetheless, there were several sources of cohesion in the camp. In a sense, what held prisoners together? What made the prisoner community, what were the ways in which they worked together? For me, the 2 most surprising things, first was this turned out to be a de facto family camp. It was supposed to be a labor camp. But in the purchase of labor permits, some people came in, would buy permits from corrupt Germans for underage children, and they would come in anyway. And after the camp stabilized, it was after the death rates had dropped, for many Jews who had paid to have their younger children hidden by Poles, made the decision that it was safer to be inside the labor camp than to risk being denounced outside. It was very unsafe to be a hidden child in Poland. It was very insecure. So that not only would they smuggle food and medicine into the camp, they smuggled children into the camp. And the children's population in the camp grew. Now they could do this in part because they were also bribing Germans to warn them when inspections were coming, and they had very elaborate hideouts for where the children would be hidden. But there was a group of children in the camp, a large number of teenagers who were in because they had lied about their age and come in at the beginning. But it really is a de facto family camp. And family as a unit was absolutely crucial for survival, particularly when the epidemic of typhus swept through the camp, because people in the family would get it in succession. And once one had typhus, one was immune. And somebody who was now immune could then care for the next person and so on. Certainly during the killing period, you needed somebody who would hide you, who would bring you food, would take care of you, even carry you on their back to the factory so you wouldn't be left in the barracks when they came sweeping through to kill sick Jews. So that to be in the camp as part of a family unit gave you all sorts of support that would not be there for people who came in as individuals, and was one of the ways in which I think the social networking of the camp, in which the structure of the prisoner society was different than most camps under the Nazis, because most of the prisoners there came from their own community. Families were still fairly intact because the buying of work permits had been a family project. You bought work permits for the father, the mother, the teenage kids, you smuggled in the young kid, and families would remain intact. This, of course, meant that it's the better off families that are in camp and the poor families that couldn't buy work permits that went to Treblinka. But those that were in the camp, usually at least part of the family is there. Very few people initially went in alone. They are there with other family members, and it gives the camp a whole dynamic that is different than many other accounts of other camps. The other sort of survival aspect of the camp that took me by surprise was the extent of the underground camp economy. These people are producing for the Germans, but they are also producing for themselves. The Germans had set up a special barracks of skilled workers, and the tailors and blacks, leather workers and others had gone into the camp, in fact, the day before, some with their families, and they got special privileges and they made things for the Germans. But they not only made things for the Germans, they made things for the camp council that would then use these to bribe others. And lots of other people set up private businesses. That is, if you had access to outside capital, which the locals did, you would bring that in and you would set up a trading network. Somebody is working in the warehouse. You buy what they steal, you take it to somebody else who's a skilled worker, you have them turn it into something, and then you fence it through a pole at the factory to the Polish community, and a trade basically grew up, a production and trade, export out of the camp to bring in food and medicine. And this reached a fairly sophisticated scale. Part of it was the ability to bribe the Ukrainian guards. That in fact, prisoners could leave the camp and go into town and conduct business. You bribe a Ukrainian, he comes with you, or he turns his back and lets you go in. When you come back, you have to split, you have to pay him off. They weren't much afraid of people not coming back. It was safer to be in the labor camp than it was to be roaming the streets of Starachowice, where somebody denounces you and you're dead. So people went in and out of camp. At the end, it got so much that people just simply come to the fence and trade. So the camp as an underground economy reached after close to 2 years, a certain sophistication, a depth. Even those who came in with no property found useful niches. For instance, you needed carriers. Who was going to take the risk of carrying stolen goods from the factory through the Ukrainian guard into the camp where something else would be done with it? Most of the Jews without property basically had to become the transporters because they didn't have their own capital, but they could provide a very crucial function for other businesses and therefore get a cut out of the proceeds as well. So I was surprised to the degree that the prisoner community had created a de facto family camp. I was very surprised to the degree they had created an underground economy that basically exported out of the camp and traded with the surrounding community. Certainly when, I'm sort of trying to put this all into a kind of wider perspective, in a sense, what lessons or what more broad generalizations could one make about the Starachowice camps? And what did it tell us about capacity to survive under those circumstances? One was my feeling that the polarization with which historians often have talked about Jewish prisoners in the past is utterly inadequate and inappropriate. Resistance on the one hand, passivity on the other. This is sort of, did you resist or were you passive? Therefore, the need to elevate resistance and to exaggerate it because the alternative is passivity. Those two poles are totally irrelevant. There isn't resistance in this camp. Making bullets for German guns and putting money in German pockets is not resistance. But it is survival. It is a struggle for survival. And the ingenuity with which people tried to survive, the creation of an underground economy, the smuggling of prisoners, the bribing of Germans, all of this does not fit with our notion of resistance, but it certainly is not passivity. And I think we need a totally different vocabulary. We need a vocabulary that talks about ingenuity, adaptability, perseverance, endurance, and words that describe or attribute passivity on the one hand or kind of heroicized resistance on the other simply are irrelevant to the options and the experiences of the prisoner community in Starachowice. Another issue that often comes up is, in a sense, what is the relationship between prisoners and are there ethics in the camp? Certainly we have, reading Primo Levi, he talks about the law of the locker. Everyone there is out for individual self-assertion. You don't survive unless you basically are out for yourself. That did not bear out in Starachowice. Now clearly a kind of universalistic ethic, do no harm, is impossible. As one survivor said to me, I couldn't help someone without hurting someone else. If someone is getting more food, someone else is getting less. If somebody's getting a cushier job, somebody else is working at the blast furnace. Much of life in that camp is a zero-sum game. And anything you do for some person comes at someone else's expense. So an ethic of do no harm simply wasn't going to encapsulate things. But neither was it a kind of unlimited self-assertion, every man for himself. What I found that seemed to emerge from this was a concentric circle of degrees of moral obligation. Almost every prisoner accepted that what you did to save your family was acceptable. You had no obligation to anybody else before your obligation to your family. Secondly, once you had been obliged to your family in the sense that you had anything left over to give, it was to your neighbors and your townspeople. And if there's anything left over in that, then it's to the Jews from the area, and finally, say in Birkenau, it's to Jews as opposed to Poles or Hungarians. But there would be a kind of gradation of moral obligations, with the core of which was what you did to protect your family, to save your family. Virtually everybody else understood and forgave because they knew they'd do the same thing for their family. So you did have a kind of moral hierarchy that couldn't be placed in a total individual self-assertion on the one hand, or a hopeless kind of universal ethic on the other. Now certainly, I talked earlier about kind of the sensitive areas of this, and I did mention the subject of prisoner revenge. And I think I want to talk on that very briefly because it is an important aspect that did not come up until very late in my research. The last group of prisoners that come into the camp are prisoners that are evacuated from Majdanek. And they're a collection of prisoners, some who had been POWs in the Jewish-Polish POW camp in the Lublin district. Some had been survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto that were brought down to Lublin and then dispersed. Some of them had been skilled workers who were kept in various Gestapo stations to make silver ornaments and leather boots and that sort of thing. As the Soviets are approaching in the spring of '42, these people are collected in Majdanek, and then a group of them are sent to Starachowice. Well, they arrive and they find Starachowice unbelievable. There's Jewish women and children still alive? Who could imagine? There are Jews running businesses. You can go to a restaurant. Somebody who's cooked a potato and selling it on the street, this is going to the restaurant. It's unbelievable. So they're just astonished that a place like Starachowice still exists. But they're also terribly embittered that Wilczek and his coterie cut them no slack, consider them the last people in and the least privileged. After what they've been through, they aren't about to take that from anybody. There is, in fact, an internal power struggle. Wilczek ups his bribes, and the Lagerrat prevails, and the newcomers are basically put in their place. On the day the camp is evacuated, Wilczek and his coterie are put in the first train car, and the Lubliners, as they were referred to, slip into the first train car too. And on the train between Starachowice and Birkenau, basically Wilczek, his son, the head of the camp kitchen, some other functionaries are strangled. That they're murdered. in an act of revenge, settling of scores. When the train reaches Birkenau, their bodies are laid out on the first cars. They're laid out on, everybody that marches past sees the corpses there. All of them knew this had happened. Of course, the word of what happened spread like wildfire among the prisoner community. No one talked about it until 1989. The early testimonies, one person referred to it elliptically, I'll get to that, and then his testimony is cut off before he gets to it. So I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what. They don't talk to it to the German investigators. You're not washing dirty linen in front of German investigators, and that's just not the audience in which you're going to do this. The initial sort of public testimony in the 80s, this does not get dealt with. It's not until 1989 that a few people begin in their testimonies to broach it. And then once the dam opened, as I say, it shifts from communal memory into public memory. And it, of course, is one of the most sort of difficult and sensitive topics of the story. But certainly if one goes back to, in a sense, deal with this body of testimony and what one has with this, I think it's very important to realize we're not doing Holocaust history and we're not reading survivor testimonies because we want redemption, they want to feel good. The Holocaust is not a feel-good story. And that we can't expect the survivors to give us feel-good stories and to leave us with a feeling of redemption in all of this. And that we should not be sanitizing these stories. The important thing is that the survivors have talked, they've told us their stories, we learn from them, but we must not expect from them, we must not demand from them that they give us a feeling of closure, a feeling of redemption, a feeling that everything has worked out, because that simply is not what the story is about. Thank you very much.
Professor Browning, thank you very much indeed for your very, very interesting presentation. And now the floor is open for questions and comments.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this interesting overview and the far-ranging interpretation of a very specific research on even the whole perception of the Third Reich functioning. I think the distinction of various factors of the policy and the occurrence of murder and survival in the Third Reich, that is the ideology of murder, the economic needs, and I think also necessary to consider is the logic of maintenance of power, which is also involved in the camp structure. But these three things also make the whole system running in general. My first question refers to your very interesting typologization of the testimonies of survivors, which, according to my understanding from the Mauthausen Survivors Research Project, which is still ongoing and should be finished next year, shows a very similar degree, progress of changing perceptions of how to interview and what to interview or what to transmit to our historic understanding. But I mean, you know, Michael Pollack's path-breaking Grenzen des Sagbaren, limits of the disable or the sayable, always in these testimonies there are agreed and silent perceived borders until the testimony can go. The survivors can talk about, but normally not beyond these internal as well as societal borders. But these borders are expanded over the 20s, 50s, 60s, 70 years already. But it's not only the borders of the sayable, but it is also working in your research. I'm sure you have experienced this. Hilberg has also experienced this. The self-restrictions of the research, also the researchers, also the public, also the media, have borders which they do not want to and cannot transgress. So in the process of research, as you described it, we have to consider also these self-limitations of researchers about the Holocaust. And the second question, I mean, I'm sure you did experience this, but you should, I think, maybe you have a lot of reflections about your own work and the work of colleagues doing the studies in the same field. The second problem refers to the typologization of the Germans, as you described it, and also the typologization of the inmates, of the survivors, or those who survived being an inmate. These typologies, I think, have one problem. They construct a kind of essential differentiation, which is not true. I question the possibility of persons maintenance that type. So survivors as well as perpetrators behave in special situations as bad Germans, dangerous Germans, as corruptible Germans, or as empathic helpers. So this typologization, which was developed by the survivors, of course, or by the prisoners, of course, was useful. But I think as historians, we should not stick too much on these ontological differentiations. And the final problem, it's coming out of your closing remarks, is, and it's still an open question which will touch a lot of taboos which Holocaust research and perception and memories have. It is the dissolution of victim and perpetrator. The term victim is problematic anyway, but also the dependence on, it's a fashionable term already, agency. So even prisoners in the death camps, in the worst situations, have certain possibilities, abilities to act, to influence even the worst situations for the good or against themselves. This is a topic of the actual research which we do in the Mauthausen Survivors Research Project, and then hopefully accepted project of Mrs. Brücker, which has been recently submitted to the research grant. But thank you very much for this comprehensive and I think also path-breaking conception of the realities inside the camps, and of course also having the persons being submitted to power and the persons using the power. Thank you.
Yeah. On the issue of essentializing, certainly these every generalization is a kind of essentializing. What's important was that it was important to the survivors, to the prisoners. Now, we know that almost even the most fiendish Nazi could at some point to where he had not killed somebody he could have killed, and therefore he wants to be exonerated. But for the prisoners, it's not that one inexplicable exception is the fact that he's a dangerous German 99% of the time. They have to operate by these. Certainly when people in that situation become something else, once they're no longer a factory manager in Starachowice, or once my reserve policemen are no longer in Reserve Police Battalion 101, but are back home, they behave very differently. But as long as that situation is basically the same, their behavior is relatively predictable. And that's the way people are going to react with them. Certainly in terms of borders, this is very important, and an area where I had to, in a sense, both work with other people's borders and a border I would set myself was the question of rape. Now we know there were different sexual activities in the camps. There were consensual relations between young prisoners. Many of these people are 18, 19 years old. They don't know if they're going to live very long, whether they'll ever have a family. And there's young people of the opposite sex. And there is a fair amount of consensual sex that goes on in the camp. There is also bartered sex. That is, somebody wants a protector. Everything in Starachowice cost. And therefore, one way in which women had of agency was to select a particular protector and have relations with him and be protected by him. So she is making a choice about who she's going to, in a sense, sign on with. More problematic, and what people less want to talk about, of course, is the non-consensual, non-arranged sex, particularly that involving the perpetrators, the Germans. And one of the commandants, in fact, carried out not only rape, but what I would call exhibitionist rape. That is, he did it on the desk of the office with the window shade up as not only an act of rape, but an act of humiliation of every male in the camp, that you cannot protect your women. This is how much power I have. No man has ever mentioned that rape in any testimony. That's their border. 3 women to me would talk about it. They would never talk of it in front of a camera. In the camera, their grandchildren are going to be watching. You know, they can't talk about this. But 3 would talk to me personally in personal interviews. And so then I had to decide what was my limit. And so my limit was say it's historically important that there was a commandant who carried out this kind of horrific rape. It is not important who that woman was. So I do not talk about that. I do not reveal the name of the victim. That is my limit. And we make those decisions anytime we work with this material. And there's no rule when you do it. You have to make up, I have to make up my own decision, and that was mine. The rape was historically important. The identity of the victim should still be protected. And that's where I, in a sense, drew those lines. You had one other question I'm not quite sure, I can't remember now.
That was
the first one.
The first one was quite clear, the distinction of the different elements of the logic of the camp, of the structure. But the problem of persistent behavior, this is, if you could work about a little bit on this. So the same person changes. So in the aftermath, the typification goes on, which is done, which is necessary to survive if this typification is valid, if it's realistic. But in the aftermath, also the very strong, you mentioned also the distinction between resistance and accommodation. All these concepts are post factum constructs which should not unclear our understanding of the camp. This was the other point which I wanted to make.
Yeah, well, a historian always has a kind of huge field of different facts, and we try to impose a kind of order on it so it can be communicated, and so we invent terms. We construct terms. We construct a narrative, because otherwise I can't give a lecture. Those aren't Platonic ideals. They are not discovered from above, but they're still necessary. I mean, we can't write history, we can't talk history if we don't have certain generalizations, if we don't construct certain categories to put some way of this mass of infinite variety of behavior into some sense.
One word, excuse me. And this is on these generalizations. Also, these generalizations are fortified, are reconfirmed by societal limitations. Historians, science is also depending on sociological mechanisms which work in our profession, in ourselves. So these are the other kind of limitations I wanted to mention. It was not possible to ask these questions about the integration of the submitted ones into the system of persecution before, let's say, before you mentioned the year of 1989. Why did you do it? Before, let's say, before the 1990s. These limitations of what we want to research are also highly important, and that explain, I think, also why you discovered 10 years later the topics you researched effectively recently.
Good, thank you.
The question is almost answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I enjoyed it a lot. I have 4 questions or short questions or remarks. The first one, did you conduct interviews with the Polish people or Ukrainian people, or only with the victims? Second one, does anybody mention kind of a good German? Was it an expression used by the interviewees? I met in Israel last January a lot of people from another labor camp, from Drohobych. And I met 2 people who said that for the first time they wanted to speak about a good German, someone who just let them escape or let them do something. And could you elaborate a bit on the dates, 1989 and 2000? Why these specific dates? And my last question, of course it is very important to say that the testimony we have are not always accurate. And don't you fear that some negationists could use these words to elaborate further in this direction?
Yeah. In my particular testimonies, the phrase good German does not occur. They use anständige Deutschen, or decent German. Now, maybe other camps, they did, but not in my group. To the last question, I can't gear what I do based upon what some crackpot denialist is going to do. I'm going to write my history. And if it's good history and defensible history, I don't have to worry about it. I mean, they may attempt, but basically the better history we write, the better off we are. And that's, as a historian, that's the single best response to the deniers, is to write really good history and documented history. You have to remind me. 89 and 2000. 89 because that's when the first 2 testimonies that in fact explicitly talk about the revenge killing occurred. That's just when the interviews were given. 2000 is when I had my first interview with a survivor, because that's where I'd reached in the stage of my research. Nothing magical about the year, it just happened to be when I began my first interview.
Polish or Ukrainian?
Oh yeah. No, I have overwhelmingly the 292 Jewish witnesses, the court testimonies of a small number of Germans, but I have no Polish source, no Ukrainian source. When I went to Starachowice and had contact with some people, I asked if there were people I could talk to, and they said no. I went down to the steel mill, which was a very early steel mill in Polish history. Is now a museum to early Polish industrialization. So I walked through the steel mill, looked at their literature, and then asked them, since it wasn't in there, could they tell me a little bit about the period when the Jewish slave labor worked here? Oh, it wasn't here, it was up at the munitions factory. They simply denied it even occurred. So I had no entree to Polish testimonies. And the Ukrainians, there were just a handful. We don't even know them by name. The prisoners had nicknames for them, but we don't know the full name. We've never identified a single Ukrainian guard from this camp.
Okay, let's speak personally. 19 years ago, I saw you for the first time in the Holocaust Museum. You were, the opening conference, the notorious panel about your book, Goldhahn and Attacking You, and I actually thought, this man is really good. Yeah, I was in awe with what you did that night, and of course I'm in awe once again 19 years later. But since I've seen you every 5 or 3 or 5 years, I've seen you talk about other topics, and realize, as Eva Kovac said, the incredible arts you've created since your first work on the Foreign Office via the origins of the final solution, ordinary man, and so on. And now you've arrived at that point. And in some way, I would like you to reflect for a moment, as a historian, of having made that journey over now 30 years, from Mr. Luther in the Foreign Office to that woman on that table. And I wonder if you would be willing to reflect on that, if this is within the boundary of what is possible tonight.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't planned. I would say most of the time, the topics I have come to serendipitously. That is, I started to research something, and then something else turned out to be a more important path. So I was working on, for instance, the Foreign Office book is when I came across Serbia. And suddenly, this fascinating case of what the German generals did there, as Walter Manacek also discovered, is fascinating. So I took a detour to Serbia. Then I was working on the book for Yad Vashem, and I came across the verdict of 101. I went and studied that. That's also when I came across the verdict for this. I came across incidences that were both very unusual, but unusual and promising to illuminate much wider questions. So I've liked to work in case studies. In the sense, if there's a theme, it's case studies. A case study of the Judenreferat of the German Foreign Office. A case study of the German military in the Serbia, as opposed to, say, Soviet Union. A case study of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a case study of the Starachowice camps. My next is a case study of an American rescuer. I'm going to yet another area that I've never touched on before. So I like to take manageable cases that speak to much wider issues because I can get down to the detail. In the sense that if it speaks to my inclinations and what I'm comfortable with as a historian is to get down to the level where you're dealing with people with human faces, where the personalities are there, and you can draw very vivid pictures that then illuminate much wider questions. So if there's a thread that goes through all of that, I think that's it.
You spoke about the taboos, what questions could not be posed and what could not be discussed before. But there is also the phenomenon of inventions of fascination with cruelties, with rape that did not occur and were told afterwards, like Katzetnik in Israel, who invented the whole brothel that never existed. And I wonder if you also met such mystifications in your work here.
I mean, one of the things that I wanted very much was to have a large body of testimony. The advantage of having 292 survivors is you can check testimonies against one another, and what emerges is a few outliers with fantastic, fantasies quickly become apparent, and you can shift them aside and proceed without, in a sense, falling for it. If you have only one witness, how do you check them? And then one is susceptible. I always wanted to, in this case, to get as many testimonies as I could to guard exactly against that. Now, certainly, insofar as something wasn't a fantasy, but incorporated, was this arrival in Auschwitz where many of them claimed that they looked Mengele in the eye. Well, this didn't happen, but it's in their mind, and they tell it. I don't have anything totally made out of whole cloth that is just totally invented, but there are areas where iconic tropes are implanted upon events in that way. But my hope was, with enough testimony on a very large number of people talking about a very small topic, I could exclude that danger. That was my hope.
Hello, Professor. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I'm a filmmaker, and I've read your book, Ordinary Men. I've heard that they are planning to make that into a film. Is that correct? And could you say something about that, how they plan to do it? Because it's quite a an academic book, of course.
I have not been contacted by, and I'm not part of any current film. Now, there was a Belgian documentary filmmaker who was working on a topic in which that was a part of, and he interviewed me, but I never saw what came out of it. So I don't know whether that was ever completed, but I am not part of any current film projects. And of course, I don't own the battalion. So I can't prevent people from making a film about Reserve Police Battalion 101. They can go to the archives and, get stuff themselves. So, if that happens, I don't know. I mean, we know sometimes they take advantage of historians so that, some movies they will have an historical, advisor. Some people one person did approach me and wanted to do a kind of a film of it, but I just didn't like their whole concept. And so I said I wouldn't cooperate, and then they went and did something else.
Thank you very much. So it's just a rumor then?
Oh, well, they may be doing it, but it's not a rumor I've heard.
Yes, if not, thank you. Thank you very much for this stimulating discussion. And see you again on the 15th of November at the presentation by Bettino Stangnet on Adolf Eichmann. Good evening.